بسم الله الحمد لله الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is our next part in the discussion about the abolition of the Khilafah, 100 years. This is our second part where I'm going to describe the rise of Mustafa Kemal, the Turkish leader who abolished the Khilafah, and some of the reaction globally of Muslims at that time, and see what lessons that we can draw from it. So we go to my slides and we will look at this now. I shared this photograph last time just to illustrate that the man on the left, Mustafa Kemal, who was a celebrated Ottoman war hero, eventually became the man on the right who wants to dress more like a European dandy. And this is what was just a superficial symbol of what it meant to be becoming more secularized and westernized. But this is just part of a much more sinister agenda, which I will explain. Kemal was born in the Salonika region of what is now, what was then the Ottoman Khilafah. It's nearer, you can say, nearer Greece, borders between Greece and Turkey in today's maps. There is evidence that he might have been, or there is reports that he might have been influenced by Western ideas at a young age. One of his biographers, H.C. Armstrong, said that he was exposed to ideas by French Dominican monks whilst living as a young man in Salonika. And another biographer, Patrick Kinross, said that he was sent on a military mission to France where he was exposed to ideas of Voltaire and Rousseau, and actually infatuated with the idea of the French Revolution. And certainly some of the experience of Kemal after this was consistent with this in terms of what he did. One person he was influenced by was a Turkish thinker called Ziya Gölkalp, who died in 1924. He was a sociologist, a poet, a thinker. He had been associated with the Young Turk movement at the tail end of the Ottomani Khilafah, and that was obviously a movement which was influenced by secular ideas. As such, he was, and nationalistic ideas, I should say. As such, he was implicated, but being part of that Young Turk movement, implicated in their crimes of their regime and imprisoned on Malta afterwards. And when the Young Turks assumed power in 1908, Ziya Gölkalp, he started propagating his extreme ideas of Turkish nationalism as opposed to Ottomanism. Ottomanism, the idea of Ottomanism is, if you understand the extent of the Ottomani Khilafah, covering a region that today would be considered in Iraq in the east, to the through Turkey down to the Hijaz, Mecca and Medina in the south, across into Europe, into what is today Eastern Europe and Central Europe, Bulgaria, Hungary, Greece, up to the Crimea in the north, which is under the control of Russia today, fought over between Russia and Ukraine, and right over to Algeria in the east. You have this vast area, this vast melting pot of people who are all considered part of the citizens of the Ottoman Khilafah. So they can move freely between those areas, and their identity, whilst they do have a variety of languages, they had a variety of cultures in that, and they were held together politically by this idea of living under the Khilafah. And remember that at its zenith, the Ottoman Khilafah had more non-Muslims in it as citizens than Muslims. So Ottomanism was this idea that your tribe was not the thing that bound you together. By contrast, Ziya Gölkalp was one of those people who adopted the idea that Turkish nationalism, that Turkism should separate us from Arabs, from European Ottomans, from North African Ottomans, from etc., etc. Yeah, so it was more about binding people on a pan-Turkic idea, or Turanism, versus pan-Islamism, which prior to the Young Turks, Abdul Hamid II had this idea of trying to strengthen the Uthmani state by reminding the Muslims of the world that he is the Khalifa for all the Muslims around the world, including the millions that lived, say, in the Indian subcontinent or in Africa and elsewhere. Golkep also saw secularism as a rival power to Islam. And he was infatuated with the European idea of the nation state. This is a quote from a work of Golkep called Turkish Nationalism and Western Civilization. Translation as taken from Islam and Modernism by Maryam Jamila. Now the mission of the Turks is nothing but to uncover the pre-Islamic Turkish past, which has remained with the people, and to graft Western civilization in its entirety onto it, in order to equal the European powers militarily and in the sciences and in industry. Our only road to salvation is to adopt Western civilization completely. I mean, this is like an example, sadly, of someone who's very colonized in their thinking, and we've seen this in our modern day when we see some politicians and thinkers talking in this kind of way. It's extremely depressing and extremely shallow as well when you look at that. I mean, looking at like Turkish past, if you look at that region, it's very hard to define people in that kind of way prior to modern nation state thinking. A further quote from Golkep from this essay he wrote, or this article he wrote published in New York. Among the pre-Islamic Turks, patriotism reached its highest levels. In the future, as in the past, patriotism should be the most important area of morality for Turks, because the nation and its soul is ultimately the only self-existing unit. Loyalty to the nation state must take precedence over loyalty to family or religion. Turkism must give the highest in priority to nation and fatherland. So that gives you some idea of the thinking of a guy like Ziya Golkep. And it's remarkable, actually, when you think, those of you who have seen nationalism anywhere, whether it's Turkish nationalism, Arab nationalism, Pakistani nationalism, Bengali nationalism, all of these kind of nationalisms in the Muslim world, they actually were not a significant feature until the tail end of the Ottoman Khilafah. The rise of nationalism and the divisions that created, and not just the divisions that created, when you see the language that Golkep is adopting, that the nation is higher than everything, family, religion, everything. When you see it, you can see how divisive and dominating nationalism can become. So, and that's why Mustafa Kemal adopt those ideas. You can see that actually he adopted these ideas, and according to some writers, Hitler himself was deeply interested in Turkish affairs after 1919 and admired and sought to imitate Atatürk, which is the nickname that Mustafa Kemal was given, the father of the Turks, his radical construction of a new nation from the ashes of defeat in World War I. And Hitler and the Nazis effectively tried to do that in Germany after World War II. So these evil nationalistic ideas were adopted, which then led to an expansionist idea over Europe and the rise of thinking about pure Aryan race, and Hitler apparently once said that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was his master, and that he, Hitler, and Mussolini were his students. And he described Atatürk as a star in the darkness, his inspiration for remaking Germany along nationalistic, secular, totalitarian, and ethnically exclusive lines. So I'm going to briefly talk about Mustafa Kemal's rise to power. And it's a long history and it's complicated, but I've started with these hidden views that he had, which, when I say hidden, actually there are many reports that other soldiers and other officers around him did understand that he had these views, but they're held in small groups, small circles. In this stage, he's not trying to impose them on other people, so they're maybe not widely known. In World War One, in the Western attempted invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula, Mustafa Kemal was one of the commanders that resisted that and led to the defeat of the Western allies at Gallipoli. So he was hailed as a hero. But he had, for various reasons, including some of the strange ideas that he was propagating, a few years where he was kind of sent into the wilderness by his commanders in peripheral areas fighting. But as the Ottoman Khilafah lost in World War I in 1918, the peace process that was established after that under the Treaty of Sèvres was extremely punitive on the Ottomans. And it was being portrayed that the Khalifa at the time, who was a weak and figurehead Khalifa with no real power, with an occupying British force in Istanbul and around it, was going to accept these terms at the Treaty of Sèvres, which were basically eviscerating the whole Ottoman Khilafah. And part of that evisceration was the loss of Greece, which led to wars between Greece and Turkey, which Mustafa Kemal was deeply involved in. And ultimately, the British withdrawing their support from Greece meant that it was seen as a victory for the Turks after the defeat in World War I. So Kemal became again another celebrated war hero. But it's at this kind of time where his differences with the Istanbul center were most pronounced. And he went to Ankara and he set up a rival political power. So you had almost these two political powers in Turkey at the time, the Istanbul center where the Khalifa was, and the Ankara center. The Ankara center, characterized by these Turkish nationalist ideas, was seen as one which was more strong, more independent, more defiant towards the West, and therefore won a significant amount of popularity. And the Western powers therefore invited representatives from the Ankara Center to the Lausanne Conference to actually make the final settlements with the Ottoman state after World War I and agreed to certain powers. And obviously, Mustafa Kemal, with his nationalistic ideas, would not have had a problem with giving up the Hijaz, giving up North Africa, giving up Cyprus, giving up Iraq, and these kind of things, and just adopting a Turkish homeland in what is today modern-day Turkey. And the question remains for people looking at this: was he a genuine nationalist who opposed Western imperial interference, which is how he is characterized by nationalists in Turkey that celebrate his memory, or a secular nationalist who was bent on destroying the Khilafah, who kept his views hidden for many years, but then played those out when he actually adopted some power? Well, Kemal himself sent mixed messages on this issue. Dr. Reza Pankhurst, in his book, The Inevitable Caliphate, has these very interesting quotes. In a telegram from Mustafa Kemal to Colonel Rifat Pasha on the 16th of March, 1920, Kemal says, "The liberation of Istanbul would win the applause of mankind and pave the road to liberation, which the Islamic world is yearning for." So playing to Islamic sentiments then. So it gives you some idea that how this secular nationalist, Mustafa Kemal, who became Ataturk, was in the environment he's in, is one which he knows he has to play. In 1920, he knows he has to play to Islamic sentiments. So the liberation of Istanbul would win the applause of mankind and pave the road to liberation which the Islamic world is yearning for by delivering the seat of the Caliphate from foreign influence and defending it with religious fidelity in a manner worthy of our glory, as well as realizing the independence of the nation. So he is appealing to his military officers through Islamic sentiments and nationalistic sentiments. 2 years later, in a letter to Rifat Pasha, he talks about separating the Caliphate from the Sultanate and then abolishing the other, which eventually he did. November 1922, he abolishes the Sultanate, and the powers of the Sultanate get adopted into the Turkish Grand National Assembly in Ankara. And then in October 1923, he abolished the office of the Sultanate altogether. And he justified that by saying the issue of the Caliphate is actually the greatest Islamic affair, since it was a leadership that binds together all the people of Islam, but it should not be politically the leadership, because it was a completely natural position for the Caliphate to exist side by side with the people of authority. So he is talking about separating the Caliphate and the Sultanate, and seeing it as something natural. And if you remember, in my first part, I quoted Sayyid Bey, who was a madrasa trained teacher of Islamic jurisprudence in university, who also started adopting these secular ideas and made a speech about this in the National Assembly that said, you know, there's no problem with a nation state in Islam, which is obviously wrong. So at some stage, he starts propagating kind of open intentions. Patrick Kinross, one of his biographers, says, always careful until his military victory was won to imply in public the orthodoxy of his religious views. Kemal had over past years been speaking more freely and critically on the subject of religion. He still professed himself a believer, but a rational believer, for whom Islam was a natural religion in harmony with reason, science, knowledge, and logic. Well, he was playing to a sentiment amongst some people in that time, which they felt that the decline in the Muslim world had become such that the religious bodies did not think about reason, science, knowledge, logic, etc., etc., whereas actually Islamic tradition was very rich in discussing these things. The moral treasure of the Caliphate must finally go. Kemal's task was made easier by an ill-judged foreign intervention by the Aga Khan. Aga Khan, very rich man living in India under British rule, the head of the Ismaili community there, and widely seen as a British agent at the time. So in this rivalry between Ankara and Istanbul, the Aga Khan speaks out in favor of the Khalifa in Istanbul, and Mustafa Kemal can basically say, there, you see, this British agent is supporting the Caliphate. Therefore, he presented the abolition of the Caliphate as something which was anti-Western imperial. So he went ahead and, in Kinross's words, cut out this tumor of the Middle Ages, the Caliphate, which shows the language of Europeans regarding this. So I come back to the questions that people ask about Mustafa Kemal after 1924, the genuine nationalist who imposed Western interference, or the secular nationalist bent on destroying the Khilafah, who kept his views hidden, abolishing the Khilafah as part of an internal power struggle, which is presented as getting rid of Western influence, or with an ideological intent to destroy Islam. Well, things get clearer when you look at what is Kemalism, the political philosophy that Mustafa Kemal implemented. The pillars of it, they talk about 6 elements of Kemalism: republicanism, populism, nationalism, Laicism means secularism, no religious role. Statism, kind of the state is all is in control of many institutions, and reformism. So these are, but Kemal himself apparently described it as a kind of Jacobinism. And Jacobinism was the idea that led to the French Revolution, which abolished religion in France. And that's why of the European countries, France is effectively the most hostile to any religion encompassing on any areas of state. So, even in a French state school, if people start wearing symbols of their religion, it's considered a heresy against the ideas of the French Revolution. So Kemal himself described it as a kind of Jacobism, employing political despotism to break down the social despotism prevalent amongst traditional-minded Turkish Muslim population, caused by, he believed, the bigotry of the ulema. So clearly his idea of Kemalism in theory is very anti-religious. And Kemalism in practice, well, 1924, the abolition of the Khilafah. 1924, the secularization of the education system, very same day. 1925, the hat law, banning Islamic-looking hats, the darbush, the fez, and replacing them with top hats. 1925, closing the dervish convents and tombs. This is the Sufi communities. 1925, the Civil Marriages Act. So the traditional nikah was not enough. The nikah contract was not enough. 1928, changing the Turkish script from the Arabic script. Ottoman was written in the traditional, Ottoman Turkish was written in the traditional Arabic script, changing to a Latin script. 1934, banning Ottoman titles like Effendi or Bey or Pasha. 1934, a law against wearing indigenous garments, so banning the traditional kind of garments people would have worn in the days of the Ottoman state, and ultimately the constitutional prohibition of the denial of Kemalism. I mean, wow. I mean, so what I see here is not just a trend in extreme secularism, forcing people to adopt Western practices and Western legal traditions. What I see is actually the enforcement of this in this kind of way, which ultimately even leads to a constitutional prohibition denying his theory of Kemalism, is something that, you know what, you couldn't convince the people. You had to do it by force. You had to enforce these things. People weren't adopting these Western secular ideas voluntarily, so you had to go about trying to convince them by force, even a constitutional prohibition on denying your political ideas. Lesson of this: look at what people do as a whole, not what they say. Kemal, like many rulers we've seen since, often talked the talk of Islam because he knew his people. He was a politician that understood how to connect to people. But when it actually came to his actions, they were very different to that. And people got reassured by his statements without getting worried about his actions. And that leads us to look at what happened, what was the impact on Muslims at the time. Well, I will take you to this great man. He was the last Sheikh al-Islam of the Ottoman Khilafah, Sheikh Mustafa Sabri Effendi, who died in 1954 in exile in Egypt. He was a great thinker who wrote many, many books, and he could see the dangers of what was unfolding after World War I. He saw the rise of secularism, European materialist ideas in the Middle East. He understood secular thought, taking on arguments by Kant and Darwin, amongst others, in his intellectual writings. But he ultimately saw this happening and said that the two swords of atheism and nationalism has slaughtered the Ottomani Khilafah. So he recognized there was an impact of these ideas which were affecting the Muslim world, which had led to the demise of the Khilafah. It wasn't just the internal schisms between the secularists and the power struggle ultimately between, say, the Young Turks and Abdul Hamid, Allah give him rahmah, or it wasn't just the external colonial powers trying to invade and divide up the Muslim lands. There was a fundamental problem of how ideas had been adopted and forced into the Muslim world. And they weren't sufficiently challenged, even though they were challengeable. By contrast, I titled this slide A Tale of Two Sincere Men. By contrast, another very sincere man, a famed Egyptian poet, Ahmed Shawqi. May Allah have mercy on him. Ahmed Shawqi is famous for a poem which grieved for the loss of the Khilafah. It's very moving, it's very emotional. Sultan Abdul Hamid II, when he was deposed, he admired the poem and sent Ahmed Shawqi an appreciation because of the poetry. But Shawqi, prior to 1924, did not see what was coming. He was so inspired by Mustafa Kemal's achievements that he lionized Mustafa Kemal in his poetry, and he insulted the Khalifa at the time, who had been portrayed as some kind of British agent. And in 1923, the People's Party of Mustafa Kemal had stood on an electoral campaign, including the pledge, the Grand National Assembly is in support of the office of the Khilafah, which is an exalted office amongst Muslims. So you can see that Shawqi was more influenced by the words than by the actions that were happening. Yet when the Khilafah was abolished on the 3rd of March 1924 in Rajab, 28th Rajab 1342, Shawqi was stunned by this. He was shaken by it. And then he penned his poem, which he described it literally like knifing your own mother. Yeah. So hence when Abdul Majid wrote a letter to Shawqi praising him for his poetry, Mustafa Sabri Effendi was less generous. He was, yes, it's been obliterated, the Khilafah, despite the ignorance of those who did not heed its warnings in that time. Muslims in Britain, how would they have reacted? Well, actually, the most famous Muslim of the Ottoman era in Britain was the Liverpudlian lawyer Abdullah William Henry Quilliam, who was a strong supporter of Abdul Hamid II. And after Abdul Hamid was deposed in 1908, Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam disappeared from public view, returning, some say, as a lawyer in London called Henri Leon. But this is a fatwa which Quilliam wrote in the era of the Ottoman Khilafah, where he says, in the name of Allah, the most merciful, most compassionate, peace to all true believers to whom this shall come. This was when the British were in conflict in Sudan, fighting in Sudan. And remember, Britain had control over significant Muslim territories, including in India. So Quilliam wrote this fatwa: know ye, O Muslims, that the British government has decided to commence military and warlike operations against the Muslims of the Sudan, who have taken up arms to defend their country and faith. And it is in contemplation to employ Muslim soldiers to fight against these Muslims of Sudan. So for any true believer to take up arms and fight against another Muslim who is not in revolt against the Khalifa is contrary to Sharia and the law of Allah and His Holy Prophet. Quilliam in 1896 wrote a fatwa in response to material from Egyptian separatists, and he wrote, "The Christian powers are preparing a new crusade in order to shatter the Muslim powers, under the pretext that they desire to civilize the world. O Muslims, do not be deceived by this hypocrisy. Unite yourself as one man. Let us no longer be separated. The rendezvous of Islam is under the shadow of the Khilafate." So Quilliam, very much a supporter of Abdul Hamid's pan-Islamic ideas rather than the Turkish nationalist ideas, very much recognized that these ideas about civilizing the world through Western ideas and occupying Muslim countries were going hand in hand around the world. Another famous Muslim of that era was Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall, known as a loyal enemy. He had been a critic of Abdul Hamid and actually a supporter of the Young Turks because he saw them as trying to empower the Khilafah at that time. And he'd spoken out against British policy against the Ottomans after the war. So in the dispute between the Hamidan era and the Young Turk era, Pickthall was more favor of the Young Turk era, largely because Abdul Hamid's era was characterized by a lot of threats to the states. And whilst Abdul Hamid had agreed to set up a constitution and enact it, because of many of the threats against the Ottoman state, that had not come to pass until quite late on in his ruling period, by which time the Young Turks had used that against him. So Pickthall was more of a supporter of the opposition to the Khilafah movement. And when the Khilafah was actually abolished, initially he wondered whether it may or may not have been a bad thing, but that changed. Maybe that changed as his understanding of Islam grew, because by September 1919, an All India Muslim Conference in Lucknow declared the 19th of October as a day of prayer for the Sultan Khalifa. And Pickthall, at the same time, chaired a meeting in Notting Hill in London on the same day, defending the incumbent Sultan Khalifa as our Khalifa and Imam and the revered successor of the Prophet ﷺ. So Pickthall decried the West's attempts to spread nationalism and delegitimize the Khalifa. And he also wrote exposing the British attempts to install Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the traitor during World War I, as their man in the region. So there, clearly you can see Pickthall's understanding of the Khilafah and the situation and the Western interference in the area did change over some time. Muslims in India, as I've said, they organized this All India movement, which was called the Khilafat movement. And it had Muslims in India having been affected by decades of occupation and ill treatment. They had a fairly sound understanding of Islam, and they had spoken out against the campaign in the West to undermine and abolish the Khilafah, and the Khilafah became a symbol of resistance to the British in that era. Well, of course, in India, there were also people who understood things less well and were very impressed by Western ideas, just as Turkish nationalism had impressed people in Turkey. So, lesson here, in a struggle of ideas, you don't just need to understand what Islam says, you do need to understand what kufr is and its nature. And when I say kufr in this sense, I'm not just talking about religious kufr. Nationalism, secularism, these kind of ideas are un-Islamic ideas, which you have to understand the nature, and then you would not be confused like the likes of Sayyid Bey, who would argue that nationalism and Islam can coexist in some way. In our next discussions, we'll talk about the role of ideas that permeated through the Khilafah, which led to the demise ultimately. And then after that, in future parts, we'll talk about external factors, meaning colonialism, and other internal factors and schisms. So I hope that was all of some use, and inshallah, we'll carry on this discussion. Remember, this is not just a history lesson for no reason. This is just looking at our past to understand how things changed, how ideas started to affect us, and many of these ideas do still exist until today. And we got to unlearn things maybe before we start to learn as well. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin.